Curtis Calhoun here with MMA News, and today I am joined by some of the developers behind UFC 5 coming up at a later date. Lots of excitement. I am joined by some of the developers. How's it going?
Going great.
Good.
How you
Very
doing?
well, thank you.
I'm doing great. Thanks again for the time. First things first, I want to get your thoughts on, in terms of how UFC 5 adds to the future long term of the EA Sports UFC franchise. Obviously, it's a very popular franchise among gamers and UFC fans. What can you tell us about what UFC 5, the role it'll play in terms of the long term vision of the franchise?
Well, I would say from a long-term vision of the franchise standpoint, one of the big steps that we've made this year is the migration over to the Frostbite engine, right? That has allowed us to be able to do some things that we have not been able to do on the franchise prior to. So when we look at all the things that we're going to be able to do from a dynamic lighting perspective, from a character fidelity perspective, being the first EA Sports title to be able to support having strand-based hair in real-time gameplay. All of those things are going to be quite significant as we think about what not only for UFC 5, but the future of the UFC franchise is going to be, because, as mentioned in the presentation earlier today, one of the core key franchise pillars for us was around being as real as it gets. And so being able to deliver the product as real as it gets in the spirit of being, unedited, authentic MMA, that authenticity is really important to us for the future of the sport and for the future of this franchise.
What are some things that gamers are going to see right away in terms of the impact that the new game engine Frostbite has on this franchise? What are gamers going to see and notice right away?
Right away, I would say, again, just from a visual standpoint, just the realism of all the lighting and the visual effects and the environments are outstanding. I think that the level of detail in the character, we've always prided ourselves a lot in how good the fighters and how good the characters look in UFC, but I think Frostbite's allowed us to take it to a whole nother level. And then I think the meta gameplay strategy that's going to be a big part of the franchise moving forward now with the real impact system, with Frostbite being able to deliver the authentic damage in the way that we're able to do now, and for us to be able to show that authentic damage to our players and create a sort of gameplay meta out of that, where, for example, like, you will know whether it's visually or by the play-by-play and color commentary if you end up with a broken nose, right? And if you have a broken nose, that is going to have a direct impact on your ability to be successful in the game. It's going to impact your stamina. And it's going to create a new strategy for the player to decide, do I need to find ways to better conserve my stamina to make it through the end of this fight? Or am I not going to be able to do that? And am I just going to go for broke and try to knock out my opponent on the other side of things? So I think those are some really big key areas moving forward for us.
What are some of the ways that, in terms of maybe some new gamers that haven't played any of the other UFC games, what are some ways that those that are just trying to get into the franchise and get into the UFC games, what are some options for them to, familiarize themselves right away with the gameplay and all that?
Yeah, so there's quite a few tools that we've added to onboard our users. First and foremost, our career mode has an all new onboarding experience. So we would point our newest users, go to career mode, learn the basics of our game. Our coach Davis, Valentina Shevchenko, they'll walk you through the very basics of gameplay, and they'll also onboard you into the damage and new mechanics that we're adding this year on UFC 5. And along with those tools, we've also have grapple assist. We have strike assist this year, which is new, which allows the AI to actually throw smart combinations and smart strikes for you. And all you have to do is press face button. So we've added a lot more onboarding tools for our new users, and also just the simplification of our seamless submissions, again, it's going to change the way people play the ground game because it's going to be, there's no more mini game that we have to onboard users into. It's essentially continue using the ground game mechanics that you've used in previous games will now complete a submission for you. So it's again, it's just all seamless. And I think it's great for newer users and returning users.
And in terms of the ground game itself, obviously, you know, as discussed in the presentation today, it seems like a completely new system and it's simplified in a way, right? So kind of talk to us a little bit about that in terms of what went into that decision to change the ground game element of fights on UFC 5 and what can players expect from that element?
Yeah, so essentially what we had on UFC 4 is the same foundation we're going to have in UFC 5. It's still a transition-based ground game mechanic, but our ground and pound got rehauled. You can get into these positions faster. 60 frames per second, essentially in gameplay because of Frostbite, allows our inputs to be reacted to faster. So you're going to see the quickness of our gameplay in our ground game be much faster than it was on UFC 4. And at the same time, these new ground and pound strikes with our real damage, it's going to play a significant impact on the ground game and the way you're going to play on the ground. You do not want to get hit this year, essentially on UFC 5. It's very different than on UFC 4. On UFC 4, you would fish for health events or knockdown. On UFC 5, you're going to fish to actually hit someone because you don't want to get hit. It's going to be a completely different meta to for our users and returning users as well. It's going to be great.
And in terms of what another thing that was mentioned during the presentation today is those that pre-ordered the game are going to get Fedor Emelianenko, Muhammad Ali, and Mike Tyson too as fighters too. What's kind of the plan in terms of adding potentially other classic fighters to the game? Are there any long-term plans that gamers can get excited about in terms of adding other classic fighters to the game?
So I wouldn't say, I mean, we did mention that there's going to be some Bruce Lee alter egos as well. I wouldn't say that in the immediate term we have plans for classic fighters. However, through what we're planning on doing with alter egos, there's always an opportunity for us to explore potentially what's happening in a real world moment and who might be involved in that, where we could look into, is there a classic fighter that's going to make sense to bring into the game as an alter ego that ties back to this particular event that's taking place in the real world? So those will be things that we talk about all the way through the life cycle of UFC 5.
What's kind of the role that the cover athletes will play in terms of the development of the game, you know, post-launch? Obviously pre-launch there's so many different elements in terms of, you know, how the cover athletes are in the game and adding to that element of it. What's kind of the long-term plan in terms of what role the cover athletes will play in terms of adding new features to the game and all that?
Yeah, I mean, even outside of the cover athletes, with Daniel Cormier as one of our analysts, our color commentary, he's had input in the past. We take ideas from everywhere, right? Not just the fighters and the cover athletes, but also, you know, from the design council in our community, and we'll ask them the questions, we'll take the input, we'll take the feedback from a spirit of being authentic to the sport. If there are things that they're able to recognize that we aren't replicating properly in the spirit of being as real as it gets or being authentic MMA, then we'll make those updates. And yeah, if there's actual like ideas that they have that are from a feature perspective, we of course will take all those ideas in and we will prioritize those amongst all the other things that we're trying to get in to the product year over year, and we go from there.
What's kind of the process in terms of adding new fighters? Because obviously, you know, you mentioned Daniel Cormier has a lot of input in terms of fighter ratings, adding new fighters and all that. But what can you tell us in terms of some insight into what that process looks like in terms of adding new fighters to the roster?
Sure, yeah. So we're always, I mean, I mentioned it during the Q&A section, like we're all big UFC fight fans on the team. So we look at a multitude of things. We'll look at who are the highest ranked fighters that we don't have in the game right now. who are the biggest up and comers that we see that have the potential to become that future champion one day. We have really good partners at the UFC that we consult with quite frequently, that help us make those decisions as well, because we don't necessarily have all of the information that they have. So it's a very collaborative relationship with the UFC as a licensor and partner, and they help inform us on where there may be some, up and comers that we aren't quite as familiar with that we should be keeping our eye on. And that's really how it goes. We talk through those. We look at who's coming up in events, again in the spirit of fight week and real world events. Like if we see somebody who's going to be a headliner in a fight that we don't have in the game, that's somebody who will potentially get prioritized to go in later on in the life cycle of UFC 5.
And another addition to the game this turnaround too is the aspect of potential doctor stoppages, right? In terms of the damage accumulated, all the new aspects that have already been discussed there. But kind of talk about, like, if at any, like how significant adding doctor stoppages could be for the game.
Yeah. So it's going to be, doctor stoppage to be very realistic. So essentially what our damage system allows us is, when you take huge shots or accumulation of strikes to a certain region of the face, it's going to cause a cut or swelling, just like it would in real life. And there's going to be certain strikes that have cut properties to them, right? So like an elbow. We know that elbows cut very often. So elbows in our game will have the same properties. So the type of damage can lead to vision penalties or breathing penalties. And if you aggravate them enough, it could lead to a doctor stoppage. But we also have like cut resistance attributes as well in the game that we've added this year. So a fighter like a Nick Diaz would get cut very easily off of many strikes. But a fighter like Anderson Silva would have a high cut resistance attribute because he doesn't get cut very often in this fight. So like, much like our damage system, there's going to be no luck involved in doctor stoppages. It's all going to be based very real on the damage that's happening to you in the fight. So you have the opportunity to change your game plan. If you have a big cut over your eye, you know that your vision's compromised. You know that rounded strikes on the same side are going to be, your block is going to come up a bit slower because that's the impact of vision penalties. So you know that, hey, I better go for a takedown now because my vision's compromised. I can't see strikes coming this way. I got to go for a takedown. So it's going to change the gameplay meta. Instead of users fighting for health events like they would on UFC 4, one strike can change the momentum of the fight. And that's what I think everyone is waiting to feel and want to see with UFC 5, and they'll get to see that.
With any game that's a multiplayer, I feel like a big question that always comes up is, what's there to do in terms of those that are competitive gamers, right? That mainly like to play online and compete and get, different bonuses and bonus points and all that stuff and make your way up the ladder. What's there to do now that's new in UFC 5 for those competitive gamers that like to just focus on, grinding and playing online?
Yeah. So Ranked Championships is making a return this year, but the brand new, I'd say the new hotness would probably be online career, which we've really strived to make an extension of the fan experience. So leading up to Fight Week and after, players will be able to engage in Fight Week challenges. They'll earn rewards through those challenges, such as vanity emotes for their created characters and different customization options for their player cards. But the big selling point for competitive play is the introduction of fighter evolution. So that's a mechanic that we've taken from career mode. It's our fighter progression system, where you engage with the system to spend your evolution points to upgrade attributes and stats and buy perks. And so that'll be an area where players can compete in created fighter versus created fighter heads up. And that will be ranked. There'll be leaderboards. I'd say the last thing to mention about the fighter evolution system is that there's also a prestige mechanic. I'm not sure if I mentioned that. So once you reach your level cap, you'll be able to prestige, increasing your level cap and allowing you to grow your fighter in new, different ways.
A couple more questions for me. Once again, I really do appreciate the time. I want to ask you, because obviously, this is focusing on PS5 and the new Xbox and current generation consoles. But I want to ask you, like, are there any plans as of right now to add, like a PC port to the game and address that audience? Because I know there's a lot of UFC fans that like to primarily play on PC. So what's kind of, your response to that?
Yeah, at the moment, we do not have any plans for PC. Again, with the focus really on nailing this experience of UFC 5 on the current gen consoles and focusing on how Frostbite was going to enable us to do that and how we've translated that into the meta gameplay experience that Rama was talking about earlier. The entire team has really been focused on making sure we nail that experience. PC is something that we always talk about. So we'll continue to have those conversations moving forward.
I gotcha. And last question from me. I kind of want to just get your final thoughts on upcoming UFC 5, where people can check out new and current info on the game and learn more about it.
EASports.com/UFC.